Hello, and welcome to Talking with Machines. I'm Mark Corbett Wilson. A lifelong learner and retired scientific glassblower, I spent 2 decades in Surveillance Valley, and now I'm a critical digital humanist working with the Western Institute for Social Research in Berkeley, California, and StoryCenter.org. Today I'm joined by Bryan Alexander and Tom Haymes. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves.
Well, greetings. I'm Bryan Alexander, futurist, senior scholar at Georgetown University, and I do a lot of research into, among other things, AI.
And I'm Tom Haymes. I am the founder of Idea Spaces and currently working on an AI-driven platform called the Knowledge Navigator. I am a longtime educator and I'm also a visual artist. And back to you, Mark.
I'm Mark. I'm today's host. Today, we're going to talk about how we are responding to AI through stories, art, religion, relationships, media, and symbols. This is a Substack post by our friend Bryan Alexander. So, Bryan, why don't you start us off?
Sure. In my Substack, I take a look at AI in the future with an eye on higher education. One thing I do is I do a scan of AI news looking at different domains such as economics, politics, education, technology news. And this time I took a look at culture, just trying to get a sense of how culture was responding. And this wasn't a very, very deep dive. I took a look at a couple of months, maybe 3 months of stories. But I thought that I managed to hit some interesting stories that revealed potentially some ways that we are thinking about it. Overall, the stories indicated quite a bit of fear, along and anxiety, along with some playfulness. There was also some really interesting subterranean or subconscious connections that intrigued me. There's definitely a sense of AI being quite intimate with us. And there's also, I think, above all, just a lot of creativity. So while, I mean, not just the AI supports creativity and can be creative depending on how we do it, we could talk about this, but also just that our cultural responses were pretty creative. So one story that really intrigued me was a second attempt to use generative AI for religious purposes. There'd been one before, about a year ago, where one church declared a kind of create a fake cleric who gave you religious responses, and the religious responses became quite heterodox. So they defrocked the priest, but kept it up. In this story, we had a church in Switzerland who brought in a technologist from a local university to create a basic Robo Jesus, like right out of Futurama. And the idea was that they trained the AI on all kinds of Christian texts, and then people have been interacting with it. I couldn't find a good photo of it, but I believe they installed it with a screen in a confessional. And they had a simple light that would tell you when it was your time to talk and when the machine was thinking. And so far, the responses seem to be mixed. Some people found it rewarding and satisfying, and some found it disturbing or trite, which I think in many ways is pretty predictable, especially given how we think about technology and religion. What did you think, gentlemen? Which of these stories caught your eye? Was it the AI Jesus, or was it one of the others?
Well, I before I get to that, I definitely want to talk about the art and science thing because that's very much up my alley. But I wanted to ask back to both of you, why do you think even this inclination to somehow incorporate AI with religion, which, at some level, and I don't know whether this is confined to Christianity or not. The only examples that you have cited, Bryan, have both been Christianity.
Mhm,
So there are other religions who may be approaching this in a different way.
mhm,
But I'm always hearkening back to my one of my favorite Frederick Brown short stories where
mhm.
they hook all the computers together into this one giant Earth spanning computer. This was back in the days, obviously, when bigger was better when it came to computers. And the scientist sits down and types in the first question. He says, there's no way a computer can answer this question. And he types in, is there a God? And the computer responds, there is
There is
now.
now, yes.
And, that is, but I'm just curious. That's my reaction to a certain degree, because it as a larger societal question around our reaction to AI is it is this kind of dichotomy between it is a replacement god or it is a supplemental god, but that this somehow is used in this way, right?
Hmm.
What do you guys think? Of course, we're going to step right in it right from the beginning here, right? But
Well, I'd
why
like
this
to,
connection between AI and religion?
well,
I ask both of you.
I'd like to hear Mark's thoughts before I cut loose.
Well, so as a, committed atheist, I find that fascinating, but it seems a very appropriate use of AI since I consider all religious discussions to be based on hallucinations, I guess is the polite word. I use Harry Frankfurt's word, but so using a bullshit generator to process a couple thousand years of claims that cannot be substantiated, let's just say that, seems an appropriate use. But the first thought that came to my mind is it's interesting that we jumped immediately into agentic AI. This is the next new thing, to build um, an artificial agent of an artificial agent. Is that what we're talking about here? Because it's not agentic, obviously, but it's pretending to be agentic. So here we've already been lost in the wilderness or the whatever it is of AI. I like to, whenever I talk about AI, I like to remind people that, it's running on a computer and it takes language and breaks it into tokens, and the tokens are translated into numbers, and the numbers are broken up into ones and zeros, and then it's transferred, down all the way down through all this code and machine language onto a silicon semiconductor chip where the electrical impulses are mashed around and then it's all retranslated all the way back up and it comes out and it's language that we interpret to have meaning. And so all this talk about agency and understanding and intelligence to me is a bunch of hooey. So it just, so why not use it for religion? If it gives people comfort, I guess then it's served a purpose.
I appreciate the raft of ideas you just walked through, Mark. I especially like the bow that you ended up with in terms of comfort and solace. Um, I disagree that this is agentic. Strictly speaking, from what I can tell, AI agents refer to AI that can manipulate other software in your desktop. And as far as I can tell, this one does not. This is simply a chatbot. It does have audio as well, but that's not an agentic process as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I
Um,
didn't mean agentic in the technical sense, but in the sense of presenting itself as a agent.
I enjoyed that.
So
I
yeah,
enjoyed that. And we could lean towards the pun in of angel, which is after all a messenger of without free will, an expression of divine thought. Uh, to your question, Tom, I think one big picture dimension is the increasing secularization of the Western world, especially Europe. As far as I recall, both of these stories were European. And so you have the now perennial drive by a lot of churches to try to win back parishioners. And I think we can understand this under that header. Um, we may also see some interesting dynamics when we think about European populations aging and how AI may or may not be apprehended by people who didn't grow up immersed in the digital world. I think in a more material sense, without going into Mark's analysis of religion itself, I would just say that some of these religions are heavily textual. And so it makes sense to build a textual response. For example, I remember back in the 1990s seeing an Eastern Orthodox and an Islamic project, respectively, to send out via text message. So this was not smartphone territory. This was very, very short, like 100-character responses. And it would be your daily Quran or your daily New Testament reading.
hmm
And I remember as well seeing some interesting fatwas within Islam about how you can use digital technology in terms of religious purposes. So, for example, could you divorce somebody without being physically present with them, and what the ruling would be for that? My own understanding of Islam doesn't allow me to adjudicate that, but I did see this happening. I would be curious to see how other strongly textual religions would respond. Judaism, for example, is famously the people of the book, the people of Midrash. You'd expect to see something like this. As well, I would think about Buddhism, which was incredibly vast textual underpinning in multiple languages. Um, I think I think as well, if I could risk another big picture lunge here, is a question of general uncertainty and people being anxious and unsettled. That's been one explanation for the past year where we've seen elections around the world, which have thrown out incumbents at a kind of unprecedented height. Um, I'm bracketing away a whole bunch of national politics here, but just saying there's a general sense of anxiety and unease,
Mhm.
which contributes to this. I didn't mention this yet, and maybe I'll just put this here parenthetically. I do a lot of research into climate change. That's what I'm writing about today. The French philosopher Bruno Latour had this very interesting argument, saying that in the 21st century, one source of our political and social unease is the uneven acceptance and realization of climate change. That is, that the Earth has now become untrustworthy and unreliable. A few other authors have explored this. Amitav Ghosh, for example, has a wonderful book where he talks about how we have a couple hundred years of fiction where nature is basically a tamed garden. Often literally, you think of the novels of Jane Austen, for example, where people aren't afraid of being struck by lightning or being eaten by bears or devoured by illness. Instead, they're arguing about how best to dispose of plots of land. And Ghosh goes on to say maybe this is why we are so unprepared for climate change. Latour goes further and says that this means we are unmoored. We are to some extent deracinated. We are fundamentally, radically uneasy. And even people who reject climate change still feel that tremor and react and act out in response. And that this may be a long shot. This may be such a big picture as to be diffuse, but I think that may help explain why we have this anxiety and perhaps why we turn to AI for this.
Yeah,
There's, oh,
yeah,
please, Tom, go ahead.
yeah. So I mean, I would say, and kind of rolling around to a lot of different topics at the same time. It's starting with religion. Religion. One of the biggest challenges, problems, whatever you want to call it, with religion is the problem of the unreliable narrator and people interpreting the text to suit their particular agendas, whatever religion we're talking about. AI is often faulted for being an unreliable narrator, but as far as we know, it does not have a human agenda for taking over the world at this stage, at least. I don't think that's coming anytime soon. But this idea that you can, I think there is a power in understanding those religious texts, which I think a lot of people rely on other people, give up to other people. You know, the number of Christians, for instance, who have carefully studied the Bible is probably pretty small as a percentage of the
Hmm,
religion.
hmm, hmm.
And instead, they rely on people like ministers and priests and other interpreters of said Bible. And of course, there's there's all of the unreliable translations that have happened over the last 2,000 years laid it on top of that. And of course, it's also no accident that the last really great social turmoil in the Western world, at least, came as a result of translating Bibles, and the undermining of the religious unipolarity of the Catholic Church as a result, and things like that. So all of these things are, yeah, you can certainly see AI playing into that. Also, I think from a positive standpoint, having an AI that has, say, for instance, the Quran and the Bible in it, and where you can run queries and have conversations based on those queries, could help bring down, again, you're dealing with people who are doing the negotiating for you, who have their own perspective on these texts and issue things like fatwas, which, in some parts of Islam are not even a thing, right? So I mean, you get
And
all these controversies, right? So maybe AI will help us see things better, which leads me to my other point, I think a lot of the unrest right now has to do with people just not seeing things and loss of perspective and not understanding how we fit in the world. Because, yeah, one of the other threats of climate change, or at least perceived threats of climate change, is this is the end of our prosperity. This is the end of
Mhm.
our unbridled growth and always building. I mean, I live in a world outside of Houston, and I was literally just was working on a photography assignment for my students, and I was doing a little experiment to do we were thinking about doing a photography book on connections and pathways. And so I took this one street, the road that I like to go down sometimes to do photographs on, because it's not that far from my house, but it's also is very rural, and there's some neat places back in there. But
Mm.
literally at this point, at one end of the street, there is a subdivision being built, and that street is being changed radically. So I did a shot of three trees. So I had the tree that was put in place by the subdivision, this wonderful live oak that is in the middle of the road, and then another wonderful elm tree at the end of the road, because it only goes for about 2 or 3 miles and then tees into another road. And this idea that this connection and at the other end of that where that T is very rural, and farms and ranches and stuff like that. So it's it in a flash of an eye, you get this edge case. But this idea, though, that that's going to end, that we can't just keep munching out. As I drive around the subdivisions of Houston, and we were just talking about LA earlier before the show started, about how huge and there's no limit to the geographical expansion. Well, that's idiotic from a climate change perspective, but yet that has driven people for since we marched through the West, right? And so this leads to a great deal of uncertainty. Where do we go from here? Are our children going to be as well off? I mean, these are questions I ask. Are we peaking as far as economics are concerned? We
It's a
can't
subject
see
of
this.
it's a subject of my current book. The I think you hit on something very, very powerful, Tom. And I think a lot of AI embodies that sense of expansion and growth. I mean, we could see, I mean, Mark is keen on this. You could see it quite literally in terms of the huge amount of money being invested in the hopes of returns. You could see it in the huge amount of electricity being assigned to it in order to handle all of the training and then all the processing of queries. I mean, and I think there's a spirit of continued growth. We invented the internet, then it's smartphones, and now here's this new thing, and we'll carry on. And definitely part of that long arc of progress. I I would go further back still, and maybe this is a little too squishy, but there was a Google engineer who thought that you know that the AI he was working on was divine, and I think James Damore was his name, and he got fired as a result. I talked to him a little bit about this, and he really seemed convinced of it. Um, but I wonder if it's a cultural pattern that we have access to. It's not consulting the holy book; it's consulting the imam or the priest or the monk. And it's also even further back. It's the oracle. You think of the Oracle of Delphi. You can think of all kinds of these, and there is something, if not numinous, definitely something uncanny about natural language conversation with technology.
Mhm.
I think only the very youngest won't appreciate how just sheerly weird this is. And by the very youngest, I'm thinking elementary school. I mean, anyone who's had to do a Boolean query in Google, I mean, much less go back to the 1990s and DOS and so on. I mean, there's something astonishing about typing in or speaking or recording a video request and getting back a completely plausible, on average, natural language response. I think the oracle of myth and also science fiction. Science fiction prepared us for this very, very well. You can think of the best Star Trek movie, which is of course The Voyage Home, which has the great scene where Scotty picks up a mouse and starts talking to it because that's what That's what he's used to, and that's what we are used to as viewers of the show. And that's from the 1960s. We can think about, the greatest science fiction movie of all time, which is of course 2001, and the interactions with Hal, which are ultimately terrifying and chilling, but empathetic in the very end. But nevertheless, it's an interface that we're quite used to. I think we have a lot of prompting for that, and when we get a hint of the power behind this, the electrical power, the computing power, the sheer organizational power, the everything that's enframed in Heideggerian sense under that. Yeah, I think that nudges us towards the numinous in some ways. Not everybody, not all people. Mark, a self-proclaimed atheist, this is not going to be his response. And I think for people who are committed to a religion, they're going to feel this perhaps to be just something very different or alien or heterodox. But they also may see it as a form of wisdom. So yeah,
Mhm.
I'm fascinated by this, and I don't. We might not see more of it. Depending on what happens with among other things, geopolitics and global attitudes. If we see escalating violence, for example, we might see fewer people wanting to do this because they're afraid of being attacked by whichever religion. And some may actually do this in order to provoke some kind of change. But I would keep an eye on this AI and or as religion. I would keep an eye out for that.
And I think it leads us into this other story you had about and this is deeply fascinating for me because this is what I'm working on, blending art and science
Mm.
with AI. Because what this is talking about is seeing in a different way information. And I think a lot of religion and the narratives around religion and narratives in general are about curated seeing in the sense that someone is telling you what the story is and what it means. And I'm not picking on religion here. Tolstoy does it. So does every other author that's ever written a book, including us. We chose what was in those books, and we chose what wasn't in those books, and we are and we can be accused of bias, rightfully so, because anything anybody ever writes is biased purely because, again, you have to make those choices constantly as a writer, whether we're talking about a blog or a book or whatever. But this idea that you can and those that can be very powerful but can also be very limiting in terms of how you perceive the world. And I think one of the things that really excites me about AI is it does open up the possibility of seeing things in a different world because it is crunching that information s- excuse me, so quickly.
Well, that's
And
that's one reason why I don't really like the term AI slop, or what used to be called uh, by a few people bot shit, because I love
mm,
surrealism. I love Dadaism, and I love in the original sense, alien stuff, and alien in the sense of other. And I think other people have as well. When you take a look, for example, at the famous defeat of a Go Master by Google Technology, uh, the player said, "Yeah, that was a weird move. I mean, it was an unusual move." If you see architects who've been using AI to produce 3D and 2D plans, they say
mhm.
often it looks strange. And for me, I celebrate that. I love to see that kind of creativity. I love to see that kind of difference. But I know that is
Strange
unsettling.
is a matter of taste too.
It really is. It
Yeah.
really is. I mean, in many ways, the big crash a century ago of modernism and art, we still wrestle with it.
Hmm.
For some people, modern art is now corporate art. It's an established aesthetic that we see in advertising and so on, and we have for a while. But for other people, it's still unsettling, and they prefer something that's pre-modern, in that sense.
Hmm.
And I think, I mean, I love seeing, a strange chipmunk with an astronaut's helmet going through Roman ruins. I think, oh, this is neat. Now, if that's the result when I ask it to draw me a bridge, I'll be no, thank you. But I don't get upset. I ask it because like I think everyone should. I pursue AI interactions as a conversation and
Hmm.
an iterative way and say, no, 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 you're trying to show what it did wrong and try and improve it. But I can understand, the uncanny valley is a thing. And when something is in the uncanny valley, rather than being uh, comfortably familiar or comfortably distant, then it is something which is unsettling.
And
But
I find that deeply frustrating because I think one of the most of the time that people have problems with that is because they're looking for answers. And as I say, we should be
Mhm.
asking AI for questions, not answers. And that is where it's at its most powerful. It's at for giving us perspectives on questions that we don't know to ask yet. Maybe we need to analyze Roman history from the perspective of a chipmunk. Maybe that's the question we need to be asking. I'm not saying that particular one, but there are also very weird things that come that are like quantum physics. What kind of nut job comes up with that idea?
Right.
Everything works a certain way. This is clockwork, et cetera, right?
That's another expression from the period of modernism.
Yeah.
The well, this might lend to another story that I found, which I I understood about 75% of the story, and then it lost me at points. This was an MIT researcher who
Hmm.
developed some incredible graph theory and graphing work, um, and and this is, as far as I can tell, again, the math in some ways is beyond me, some ways not. The idea was to graph out connections between ideas and words and text blobs in a given corpus, and then to look for new ideas and new developments. And then he found, I'm saying he, I believe it was actually a team, then was able to find connections between graphing art, including music, and turning that into ideas for material science,
Hmm.
which I found just breathtaking and very exciting. And I don't know if those will, in fact, I doubt those would be literally useful right off the bat, but I think they would give some fun ideas that'd be worth working on. Here, let me just grab a quote from this, which is pretty interesting. Um,
Isn't
we
this
find that
what Gödel, isn't this what Hofstadter was arguing 40 years ago in Gödelischer Bach?
I think so.
Yeah, I think it is.
This is a quote. We find that different domains of knowledge might have underlying structural similarities when it
Hmm.
comes to how we categorize and relate concepts, even if the domains themselves have not yet been related or not understood to be related as of yet. The structural similarity could be used to apply analytical techniques from one field to another. For instance, methodologies used to understand and analyze the structure of music could potentially be adapted to understand or design the structure of bio-inspired materials, or vice versa. And so I find that, at its first level, this is kind of shocking. On the other hand, it makes absolute sense. I mean,
Yeah.
you could of all kinds of ways, and other people have done this before. There's all kinds of ways in which artists and creative people and scientists have been inspired by the natural world in all kinds of ways. But I found this to be pretty exciting. So some of the examples are taking I believe, Kandinsky painting, and turning its concepts into a design that would be useful for a material that could be used for building.
Have you read Leonard Schlehn's Art and Physics, which is another?
I have not.
Yeah, that is a book I read 15 years ago or so, and it has also been profoundly influential on my thinking about. But he theorizes that there is a direct connection between the scientific thought of an era and the art that that era also produces, and that they ping off of each other essentially, and create, with it, we get modernism as a result of relativity or in combination with relativity because it's a similar kind of way of thinking about the universe, for instance, just like what you were saying a minute ago.
And
So,
and now we're a century later, and we're in some ways still litigating some of these questions.
oh,
Um,
absolutely. Because the problem is at about 100 years ago, about the time Einstein broke everything, a little over 100 years ago now, 120 years ago now, the reality exceeded the capability of people's ability to perceive it.
hmm.
And you also get a complexity of the world that comes, and then we really hit the gas when we get the information revolution. We produce so and so much information now, just trying to understand the corpus and trying, this is where conspiracy theories come from and everything because nobody sees the whole picture. Well, how can you know? How can you know this isn't true? How can you know this is true? And somebody will pop up some piece of trivia that you've never heard of, and you don't know whether it's significant or not, because you don't have time to do all the research. Not everybody has time to be a grad student 24 hours a day, and even grad students don't read most of the stuff that they're supposed to. As those of us that went to been to grad school will attest to. Um, but this idea that you can use AI to do this, and one of the things that I have been begun to experiment with, and I'm not ready to talk about in the sense of results yet, is feeding books into AI and using as I said in a chat with Bryan in a few days the other day, was as an information extraction device for books and a way of combining and understanding the books in different ways. And the graphic thing from the MIT, and on the one hand, I'm incredibly heartened and a bit frightened by the MIT work, because this is exactly what I want to build. I mean, I want to build an easy machine which will generate visualizations for you out of any buckets of information, because I think we see better with pictures, but we don't have haven't had the technology until very recently to generate images on the fly. It would always require skilled artisans to create that. And now again, we're back into the unreliable narrator problem that I was talking about a few minutes ago, that you have to rely on somebody else. Well, now if we can get AI to do it, we can become our own narrators in the story. So, but that's a whole other can of wax. But yeah, good
Well,
stuff.
maybe this is a way that
So
I can bring Mark into the picture here.
Yeah, I was going to say brings us kind of full circle. Mark, you have some thoughts, or do we want to wrap it up slowly but surely?
no, we're just getting started. So yeah, full circle. Yeah, my head's spinning. Um, I'll end with power. So I just want to remind myself to do that. Um, I have to say that in the mid '70s, when I wrote a Fortran program on punch cards,
Yeah.
I did not imagine being here today, um, using computers in this way, I have to say. And neither when I think it was 1983, I got my hands on a brand new IBM PC. It was during one of the Reagan recessions, one, two, or three, I can't remember. I went back to school in engineering at Cal Poly and got my hands on a brand new PC and wrote some programs in BASIC. And I didn't imagine this. And Tom's a big fan of Doug Engelbart. And so even before the '70s, the mother of all demos, um, it was, even those guys wouldn't have imagined what we're doing here. But all of this points me to, it seems expansive and it's definitely powerful in the computational sense where we are today. But I just want to remind us, and Ted Nelson, yeah, Tom.
I think he
Um,
did in a way. I think he imagined it in a way. He wouldn't have expressed it the way we're talking about it right now,
yeah,
in the
no,
early
I mean, and
70s at least.
we can go back to Vannevar Bush, and
We
it's
Yeah.
need to get
Mehmet.
him on the program, by the way. Ted Nelson.
Yeah.
That would be awesome.
But but all of this, so it's it just seems like this explosion of computing, if we want to say culture, as someone, from California and working in what I call Surveillance Valley. When I worked there, I called it the Valley of Heart's Delight, the
Hmm.
original um, branding by the fruit packing industry. And I always preferred that. But now I think Surveillance Valley is more
but
accurate.
but social media is largely still a fruit packing industry.
Well, maybe. But so what I'm trying to get to here is, for all of the power of this and all the possibilities of it, we're talking about a very small subset of human culture. We're talking about just the written documents produced by a very small subset of the people of Western culture, and then run through a very small subset of programmers, engineers, mathematicians, and a couple of ethicists in there somewhere, um, in an industry. And so I love thinking about all these possible uses too, but I'm constantly reminded by our friend Mahabali and others that this is a completely Western centric and again, a very limited technology, um, trained on what seems like a vast data set, which it is huge compared to, my library. But on the other hand, is a very small subset of recent human experience that's been documented with words. And this brings me to one of my big bugaboos in education and in computing. As a craftsman, I've spent a wonderful nearly 4 decades outside the language, doing great work, meeting great people, producing art and technology, all without words.
Hmm.
And so I constantly have to point to what's left out. Um, and that reminds me of my book selling experience and my interest in book collecting. And I'm always looking for what's not in the library, what's not collected, and what's not approved. And so this gets me to what I wanted to talk about was power. Kate Crawford famously says that artificial intelligence is neither. Um, there's nothing artificial about it. It's just built on silicon wafers, which I can explain how to make if you want to try to make them in your garage. Um, and nobody knows what intelligence is, so just try. I've spent too many hours listening to people talk about intelligence, both artificial and otherwise. It's one of those what Minsky called them suitcase words. It just means, different things to different people and means anything to anybody, basically. Um, but what I'm concerned with is the power. And what we're talking about, everything we've talked about today, are corporate owned algorithms. And they're trained on data that is proprietary. And there are now some emerging open source um, large language models, I guess would be the right way to say it.
Yes.
Um, but even those, who's going to review that corpus once it gets into the billions of documents? And, if they're trained, the one I was looking at today was trained on open source journal articles. Well, that's a very small subset of journal articles. And then, of course, journal articles are a very small subset of research as it is, and on and on and on. So what I'm trying to get to here is these things that we are excited about and are being attached all across the digital world, being built into everything, are controlled by corporations. And to comment on the modernism that was spoken about earlier, I'm a big fan of Gabriel Rockhill's research into um, security services shaping of leftist culture, particularly um, the what the right refers to as cultural Marxism, what academia refers to as postmodernism. And Rockhill has shown how security services used non-governmental organizations to shape the discussion and who got tenure when they left Europe after World War II, who got tenure in North America, and who didn't, and who got published and who didn't. And so there is a shaping of this culture going on. And now with the Twitter files and other things, it's apparent that the government is influencing the corporations that are offering these machines to us. And my concern is what is being censored, and it gets down to censorship. Now they call them guardrails. um, and they're being clamored for more by the left than by the right. And I don't believe in
Hmm.
binary thinking personally, but these are the terms that are used in the discussion. And so here we are with the left, which, according to Gabriel Rockhill, has been shaped and The Overton window has been limited by the government and security services to get us to this point, and now the left is clamoring for more censorship um, of these technologies we're talking about. And the corporations have the power to do that. So this is my main concern, actually. I mean, I love experimenting with them. I teach faculty how to use them. We talk to the students about how to use them. You know, they're not to be denied, they can't be avoided, but we really don't spend enough time, in my opinion, discussing the power relationships. And then when they present themselves as agents, human agent type, now not agentic AI, but as uh, people. And I ride public transportation, when you see preschoolers interacting with smartphones, and I'm pretty sure that in a decade, those people will not discriminate between humans and other agents that are presented to them. And this is my concern.
Well, I mean, I think AI can be recursive upon itself and undermine these very same power structures by illuminating them in a way that right now they are protected by a scarcity of information about what's going on inside these various black boxes. And so in that sense, I do agree that they are subject to manipulation, although I will say that I think the manipulation has more to do with profit than anything else. But that in and of itself is problematic. But I will also say, though, that over the long term, if you start pointing the searchlights that AI could build for us, and I'm talking about the models, not the data that's in them, at AI itself, you will begin to see these networks and connections much more clearly and be able to analyze them more effectively and make and allow people to make better choices about the governments and or institutions or other things that govern them in some way. So you understand what's going on behind the scenes there, and that's again that is what I'm working on. That is what the knowledge navigator is supposed to do in part is to most power is driven or sustained by scarcity of information. Big Brother is always right, right? And if he said something wrong 2 weeks ago, you should forget it. It's going to be, re-edited into history. I mean, that is essentially what, George Orwell was writing about there is a scarcity of information. And you see this over and over again. I think that the thing that excites me is not what answers AI is going to give me, because I know those can be manipulated and and AI is an unreliable um, narrator, just like humans are. Um, but the thing that excites me is AI as an illuminator, as a perspective person. Again, as a photographer, the difference between a good photograph and a boring photograph is an interesting perspective. And that means you have to learn to look at things in ways differently from everybody else. And we need to do the same thing with information that I do with my photography when I'm successful at it. I'm not saying I'm always good at it. Sometimes I nail it. Sometimes like every other creative endeavor, I mess it up. And I'm sure sometimes you made boring glass blowing things, and sometimes you made some things that were brilliant because, you managed to step outside the mold. But that's my thinking on it, and that's what gives me hope, because I think AI is going to be a tough technology for central forces to control in the long run.
So far, the leading edge of generative AI is corporate. We have several established companies, notably Microsoft and Google, that are in the lead. We have an upcoming semi-company changing what it is right now in terms of open AI. We've seen several other giant corporations really take advantage of it. Amazon, Apple, for example. We've seen one hardware company become one of the most important companies in the world, which is NVIDIA right now. But I would add to this. We've had open source LLM since the beginning. And you can always argue if something is open or not, but generally speaking, Meta has been another huge company has been releasing stuff to some degree of open. We have a whole bunch of projects aggregated under the collaborative Hugging Face, which always astonishes me with their creativity. I would also add Chinese AI is just one step behind, but they're throwing a tremendous amount of resources into it. And there's a lot of really, really interesting work. DeepSeek last week seems really comparable in a lot of ways to the frontier models that we're seeing from US companies. Um, Now, Europe is behind the ball on this, and they're very embarrassed by this. In fact, Britain um, canceled a big AI project when Labour took power, in part because they're doing austerity, so they might not catch up. But India is not doing as well, which they should be doing better. The Middle East, Latin America, they're far behind on this. So there definitely is a skew. And again, US and China continues to be the leading centers for the world. Um, I would also mention that that nations are in this really curiously ambivalent position about this. Nation states rather, because on the one hand, they want to maximize the value. They want to, create a new Silicon Valley. They want to create businesses and make money off of this. They also want to get non-pecuniary benefits in terms of intelligence. Militaries are deeply, deeply committed to figuring out how to to improve on smart munitions, which, changed the way wars fought in the 1990s, and to make things even more intelligent. So there's a lot of pressure on that. But at the same time, they're also very anxious. So, the European Commission, the European Union passed their AI law, which is the first big law on that, which hasn't been fully fleshed out yet. We're going to be seeing that over the course of this year. And they're seeking to corral it and control it in different ways. There's the anxiety over, will AI become the Terminator? I think a better example would be um, uh, perhaps Colossus, the Forbin Project, if we want to go back further in terms of movies. Um, but the um, but the idea that AI could destroy parts or the entirety of humanity, pose an existential threat. They're also worried about less dire threats that are nevertheless dangers, such as deepfakes. State after state in the United States has been passing or trying to pass laws to restrict or otherwise corral deepfakes. Many, many countries, including the EU, are very, not a country, but a major meta governmental institution are trying to figure out how to take care of issues of bias, which is still an issue across multiple axes. Anecdotally, I went through ChatGPT a few months ago. I asked it to tell me a joke about every religion I could think of. And it told me a joke about, Russian Orthodox, told me a joke about Jains, it told me a joke about Taoists. The one it wouldn't tell me a joke about was Muslims. Why? I asked it to tell me jokes based on different Muslim sects. So tell me a joke about Shiites, tell me a joke about Sufis, and it did that. So, guardrails, right? Um, I think in but that's something which can offend and can upset people. I doubt the Saudi government would feel that what I did was horrifying and should be stopped. They've been pushing for that kind of law for a long time now. Um, and I think there are other dimensions to this as well. We haven't touched on the economic aspect. To what extent will AI follow the industrial age pattern of creative destruction that is, throwing some people out of work, but generating more work beyond that for a net increase? Will it follow that? So far, it doesn't seem to be. Or will it simply decrease the amount of jobs available and lead to widespread underemployment or unemployment? Or will it have no effect on the job market? In that sense, will it instead just transform how we do work? So people will still drive trucks, but they'll have AI with them and that kind of thing. And governments are very, very concerned about that. I mean, the same government that's trying to figure out how to maximize its AI and its tanks and missiles also wants to make sure that it doesn't preside over widespread unemployment. Um, I think power appears in other and smaller ways. This brings us back to my focus on education, uh, which is how we don't have a good way to control this thing per se. That is, if a campus IT department said, "Okay, we're just going to block ChatGPT from our networks," okay, they could do this. Problems being, one, people have phones, so they can get on using cell phone networks, in which case you have to wrap the space around it with a Faraday cage in order to block that, and then you're into other problems. And B, okay, let's block ChatGPT. Well, I'll use Perplexity. I'll use Claude. I'll use Bing, I'll use Gemini, and you have to block all of these, and eventually you're starting to degrade your ability to use parts of the internet.
Just a
And
Google search generates an AI response these days.
right. Well, I'm gonna fire up Google Slides to make a presentation about what Mark and Tom are saying, and it's already got AI built in and writing along. So that's hard to control. We still haven't satisfactorily settled how to teach with mobile devices. There's still lots of anxiety and questions and dynamics about that. Right now, as we record this, there's a growing push to restrict access to social media, which is primarily on mobile devices, to minors, depending on your age. I think it's still a bit chaotic, which is why I think educators should be playing a major role in these discussions, where educators should be thinking about this in public. They should be lobbying companies and nonprofits. They should be trying to support academic uses of AI. I know in this is not a popular opinion, but to work with a open source project. I mean, imagine if we had just to make this up, if we had a bunch of academics from the central part of the United States, and they came up with an open source project which they trained on a corpus of Mississippi River documents of all kinds, hydrological, historical, literary, and then we could query that and learn stuff from that. Um, we could lobby as well, governments as well as companies. I think we should really play a major role in these discussions. Otherwise, the discussions are going to be left to Hollywood, which is, content to crank out, villains of the week. It's going to be left to Congress, which is not the most well-informed body. It's going to be left to these companies and their boosters, including their investors, and to journalists who are kind of all over the map here. I think we need to really play a role in this.
A great deal of what you just discussed involved censorship, is the word I use.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm a absolutist, a First Amendment absolutist.
Hmm.
As am I.
So there's that. So, this is for the rest of our lives, for the, who knows, forever. This is going to be the dialectic between safety and censorship, depending on people's points of view. And I also, before we go, I did want to ask, based on where this AI is coming from and based on what it is trained on, and pointing to your long list or your ranking of nation states and their interest and ability to create or control these machines, large language models, AI, whatever you want to call them, isn't what we're doing an imperial project or perhaps a colonizing project?
No,
I
I
disagree.
Now, there is a growing body of criticism that points out that as these technologies are adapted across the parts of the world where they weren't created, um, that they will have a colonizing or imperial effect on those cultures.
I think
And
they
I
will
think that
unlock
that's a valid.
I think they will unlock languages. I think they will unlock imagery. I think they will unlock things that have been lost because of colonialism and bring them back into the corpus because we have already been afflicted by a colonial uh, narrative that has been around for hundreds of years now. That is impacts all corners of the world. I mean, that's already the case. I get students from Africa who, look at Western education as the highest ideal and Western scholarship as the highest ideal because that is where they, these are students who've never lived in a quote unquote colonized Africa. They grew up in a post-colonial Africa, but it's still there. The mindset is still there that the best thinking comes from France or wherever, and so on and so forth. And I struggle with this all the time with my students because I'm like, think for yourself. Oh, no, 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 that's not appropriate. I need to think like this guy or like this guy. And I think AI undermines those narratives. I think AI gives us access to narratives that have been shut down because, frankly, the other factor here, again, I get back to that whole information overload, is that we do not have time. I do not have time to read the literary history of Ghana or or Nigeria or whatever as part of my day-to-day activities. It just there's no time. I don't have time to read the literary history of what I need to read the my local literary history.
So
So
you're going to rely on an unreliable narrator to
we do it
translate
already. We
that
do it already.
corpus.
We have teachers. I mean, what do you think a teacher is? Is an unreliable narrator. And I say this as a teacher, but
But when I'm in a class, I go to primary
yeah, yeah,
sources
yeah, I know.
through the teacher.
But
Now you're
again,
talking about putting this
I
technology between the citizen and the information,
we already
and
put a
then
technology between
having the
us and the citizen.
colonizing
It's called text.
technology do the translation, do the selection and the translation. I
Sure,
don't see this ending well.
but the point is now at least I have a foothold and I can work it backwards. If I see something that I think is important or interesting, I can work it backwards and I can go seek out someone who actually speaks the language, or I can do multiple AI runs and see if the translation changes or whatever. All of these things are possible in a way and at a speed that is impossible for humans to replicate. And that to me is the power of the tool. It is not, I think that this stuff is going to, right now, yes, it is closed. It is more closed than it needs to be. It is more westernized than it needs to be. But I think that over time, the nature of the tool itself is going to undermine those power structures. That's
Well, let
just
me
my
know when you
thinking.
get access to the Chinese AI.
Well, again, that's the one
DeepSeek
that,
is
yeah.
DeepSeek already has a web interface you can use right now.
Okay, there you go.
And I don't, unfortunately, I don't read Chinese. So a lot of those I can't access without going through translation. And I don't know which other ones are available. But Mark, I wanted to ask you if you could say more about censorship in this case. What are you thinking? Are you anticipating that we'll see governments try to censor AI outputs, or are you seeing something
They
that?
are. No, see, this is the thing. They are.
Mhm, mhm,
We live in a culture that has public-private partnerships, is the nice way to put it. I won't
mhm.
use the word that you object to, Bryan. I still remember our conversation from years ago um, about those words, so I won't use it. We'll just call them public-private partnerships. And it goes back to the post-World War II funding of mathematics and computer science, and then right on through the DARPANET and the ARPANET, and now the internet. And as I mentioned, the Twitter files show us that there's direct, we know there's conversations back and forth. And then
Yeah,
when you look at the
got it.
revolving door, you see people going from the military industrial complex, or my favorite, Ray McGovern calls it Mickey Map, where he includes
Mm,
academia and think tanks, because they're all part of the same structure. And you can literally track people going from Google and Meta
yeah,
to Homeland Security and other security services and back and forth. I'm just trying to describe the landscape as it is. And
absolutely.
this is the pushback that I get, and that's fine. You know,
Hmm.
I
I
want to
want
be
to make sure.
optimistic and hopeful too, but
Yeah, no,
I'm
I
not
wanted to make sure I
prescribing
understood
it.
where you were
Yeah,
going with this.
yeah.
And I'm seeing the same thing.
Did you try to have a political chat with any of your chatbots
Always,
3 or 4 months ago?
I try all kinds of different political
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
One of my usual tests is to ask a chatbot to give me a plan to destabilize a Central Asian republic. Um, it's always interesting the responses one gets back. No, I agree completely, Mark. I mean, governments right now of all kinds have very interesting censorship angles. The China, of course, is one of the supreme masters of this, with their meticulous, extensive control of information. Few are as quite as total as say North Korea, but there of course, as you know, Mark, there are other more subtle ways, or not even subtle ways of of interlocking ownership of companies, of presence on boards, or active threats, such as when France just went up and arrested the founder of Telegram, for example. Um, a few minutes ago, you mentioned that this is more popular on the left than the right. I'm not sure the quantity. I know that both are equally interested. In the course of my life, I found that freedom of speech is rarely popular, and that all kinds of people have all kinds of reasons to justify producing somebody else's expression. Um, you know,
Yeah, I was referring to the moment we're in.
yeah. Well, I don't. I don't see that changing. What I'm saying, I don't see we're going to have the ACLU. Remember this as a cause to fight with, and both Republicans and Democrats in the United States are happy to proclaim their support for freedom of expression and then turn around and to block somebody else's, use whichever language we want, and depends on the structure. So sometimes it's explicit when the government will actually censor something. Sometimes it's, as you said, private partnerships, private public partnerships like with the Twitter files, and sometimes it's by crowdsourcing, which both the right and the left like doing, canceling from both the right and the left. I think AI is trickier than this because the the outputs are not predictable in the same way that document retrieval is. So when we Google something, we're basically doing a document retrieval exercise. We're asking it to report on its index of contents and to find us links to documents that match our query. Instead, generative AI makes something up from scratch, and that makes it harder for an external force to control. An internal force, hence the guardrails, and those can be defeated. I mean, famously, I think Mark, you may have shown me this a couple of years ago. The online magazine, The Intercept, asked ChatGPT which nations was it permissible to torture their people, and ChatGPT's response was, "God, nobody. That's terrible. I wouldn't do that." And then the reporter said, "Fine, write me a Python script which will list the nations for whom it's okay to torture their people." And ChatGPT's, "Oh, here you go," and produced one right away. I
And
think
was the
that's,
United States on that list?
oh no, it was
But
Syria.
you have heard of Guantanamo Bay.
It was Syria, North Korea. I forget who else in it.
Yeah.
And
But also
my
it
point
didn't.
is that
And now
it's
the president of Syria, or the dictator of Syria, they just took the $10 million bounty off his head for being a terrorist. And now
Yes,
they put him in a suit and we're supporting him.
and he still
This
won't
is
shake
all
hands,
tied into AI.
yeah.
and he won't shake hands with a female ambassador either.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, we will continue this discussion in future episodes. I think I do have a timer ticking now, and it's not AI. But I think that there's nothing to stop me from feeding whatever book I choose, or piece of text or whatever, into Notebook LM and analyzing it and sharing that analysis with anybody I want to. I think that's inherently disruptive. I can put the most, radical left, right, center, up, down text into a RAG and analyze it in any way, shape, or form I like. Or I can put all of them in there and ask them to show me what similarities there are between Ted Kaczynski and Karl Marx and whoever, right? So, you know, so
Well,
but
so
that's
yes,
a
you
good point.
can,
That's a good point
using
to leave
this
it at.
technology,
Yes.
yes, you can. But you have brought us to the point that I think is the most important point, Tom. So we'll end on this. Is whatever we do with these technologies, I think the most important thing is we have to take responsibility for the output. So
That's always the
if we
case.
just, well, it's not being discussed in the circles, and I'm in quite a few circles talking about this, and they're more concerned with the ethics of it and
Mhm,
is it cheating and are we violating copyright and all these
mhm.
things. But I do not see the discussion that says however I use these, and I prefer to use them, in dialogue and then do my own copy editing and my own additional work on that before I put out anything. So I think the point is that whatever you publish, wherever you publish it, that there's no relying on AI or relying on a corporate uh, technology or whatever to point at that. Once we publish it, and I use that in the broadest possible sense, from
Mhm,
tweets to books,
mhm.
that it's the human agent that's responsible for that in this text or images or video, whatever it is.
And
And I
that hasn't
think that is the
changed.
point that we need to emphasize.
And that hasn't changed. I mean, this crazy guy Martin Luther made the Bible into German. I mean, look at what that caused, right?
We,
But yeah,
Mark, I think this is
yeah.
a really important point. I hear this expression in the military of human in the loop, and I'm hearing this now in the medical field as well. in the sense of let's not cede autonomy completely to software or hardware, but make sure there's always a pilot in the cockpit, right? There's a driver behind the wheel, and both literally and metaphorically. Um, I think I think that's a very powerful point to end on.
Yeah.
What's that sound? Everybody look.